Good evening, good evening. We missed class last week. Unfortunately, there was other programming going on here at the shul. However, we are going to make up for it with a doubly exciting, double action-packed class this evening. We are proceeding through the Rebbe Rashab's explanation of Achdus Hashem. And we're in the tricky part. We're in the harder half of the explanation. The first half of the explanation was about the divine self-concealment. That if God enters into a state of self-expression, a state of speech, as we've been calling it, if God speaks, if God enters into a process of creation, that process does not in any way constitute or count as a change in Hashem. We explained that was the easy part. We explained that the reason this is so is because the only thing that is concealing God, the only thing that's covering God up, is godliness itself. And really, a self can't conceal a self. So when God conceals himself, really nothing is concealed at all, because the concealment is also God. So the revelation is God, the concealment is God, and so nothing really changes. All that's here is God, just like all that was here was God before creation, before God entered into any act to create. The second half of this explanation, which is the trickier half, which is why it's taking us much longer, is that not only does God enter into a process to create, not only does God speak, but God is also Beirei. God was also Bara, as the first pasuk in the Torah says. God also, he doesn't just speak, he also creates directly, as it were, something from nothing, with no process. In other words, not everything appears to be just a revelation or concealment, a manifestation of God one way or another. Some things appear to be what we call nivraim. In fact, everything in our experience, just about, appears to be a nivra, appears to be a creation. What means a creation? It means that there is something else here other than God. Not just that there's God and different manifestations or expressions of Hashem, different aspects of godliness. There appears to be something else here entirely. In fact, an infinite number of something else's other than Hashem. Right? Everything that fills our world, certainly the physical world, is a creation, is a nivra. And a nivra appears to be something other than, something in addition to Hashem. So how can you say that God hasn't changed and that the entire act of creation constitutes no true change to Hashem, when in fact, before God was completely alone, he was everywhere, and now there are places where Hashem is not. There are other things here, so to speak. There are creations, there's a zulas, there's the other, there's something additional to God here. And our answer was, we gave the answer right at the beginning. The answer is actually easy. It's the explaining it that's tricky. The answer is that the nivraim are not, they don't really exist in the important sense. The nivraim are batul. The nivraim are nullified to God. They exist, but they exist in a way where they are not any change, where really all that's here is godliness. They exist, but totally assimilated within, totally nullified within godliness. So that in the end of the day, all that's here is Hashem. All that's here is godliness. All that's here is Getlichkeit, as we would say in Yiddish. Now, the explanation of how this is so, how can it be that everything around us is nullified, is based on a long explanation that we've been in for many weeks now, a long description of the consequences of creating something from nothing. If you really, the Rebbeim say, the Alter Rebbe wrote in Tanya, and the Rebbe Rashab is explaining in different words basically the same idea the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya. which is that if you understand what it means that everything is created something from nothing, it will not be very difficult to appreciate that everything is batal, everything is nullified to godliness. So we've been going through the steps, and we've been going through very slowly because the point is to understand it. The point is not just to say, but the point is to actually understand the steps of this contemplation, the steps of this the steps of the argument. I hesitate to call it an argument because it's not really a strict argument in maybe in the philosophical sense or something you would find out of mathematics. It's a little bit different. But the steps of this thought process, let's put it that way, the steps that you go through when you're contemplating, okay, how do I understand, what do I think about to arrive at, to understand better this idea that the Nivraim are batal, that the creations are nullified within godliness. And the truth is we haven't finished this yet, so we're still in the middle of this process. But to summarize briefly what we've said so far, it's something like this. When something is, what we mean when we say something is created, something from nothing, yesh ma'ayin, it's created something from nothing. What do we mean? We mean that unlike every cause and effect relationship, every ilah v'alul relationship in our experience, where in our experience the effect is a gilui of the cause, the effect is a revelation or an expression of the cause in a different place, and that's really all cause and effect in our reality. When God creates something from nothing, the effect is a helem on the cause. The effect is a concealment of what causes it. Or in a different way of saying it, it's the same thing in different words, the effect did not exist in potential in the cause. That's really what something from nothing means.
You don't say that there's no cause.
No, it's caused by God. That's the whole point. But it's caused in a way that is something from nothing, which means something from nothing is a description of the causal process of cause becoming effect. In our regular day-to-day life, something can only be caused by a kiruv and a gilui with its effect. It becomes close with, and it becomes revealed, and that's what brings about the effect, right? So cause and effect is my hand pushing the mug. My hand pushing and the mug being pushed basically merge and become one action. Cause and effect in our reality are interlinked. The mug being pushed is a revelation of the hand that is pushing it, and they're bekiruv, they're close one to the other, right? My hand had a potential, it had the energy to move this mug. The mug is being moved, that potential is actualized, as you would say in English. It's going from kayach el hapel, from the potential to the actual, and the result is taking place, right? In our reality, all change, all effect is an actualization of a previous potential. It's a revelation of something that was in potential in the cause. When God creates yesh ma'ayin, he is not limited to this rule of logic, which is that all effects must exist in potential in their cause. He is able to make something where it did not exist in potential in its cause at all. There was no potential for this result. In other words, it was not possible, so to speak, in the normal way if we understand what's possible. It wasn't possible for this result to come about, and yet the result nevertheless happens. Works the opposite way of everything in our reality. There was no potential, and now the thing happens, right? So we gave the example we gave last week, the mashal, the metaphor for yesh ma'ayin, is when you take a rock, 2 weeks ago, pardon me, you take the rock and you throw the rock up in the air, right? The metaphor for yesh ma'ayin is the flight of the rock, that the rock is flying through the air is like something that's created yesh ma'ayin, right? Is like something from nothing. Why is it like something from nothing? Because the rock has no potential to fly, right? the rock does not have b'koyach, it doesn't have in potential the ability to fly, right? And yet, nevertheless, it flies anyway when I take it and I throw it up in the air, right? It's only a mashal, right? Don't get too caught up. It's only a metaphor. But the metaphor is that we take the rock and we throw it in the air. The flight of the rock, the fact that the rock is flying through the air, is not something that the rock had in potential. Rocks can't fly. They don't have the ability to fly, right? This is what we would call an external imposition on the rock. I am making the rock fly, right? It's not that the rock is flying. I'm making the rock fly by picking it up and throwing it. Why isn't it that the rock's flying? Because rocks can't fly, right? I'm making it fly. So the flight of the rock is like something that's made something from nothing. There's no potential, right? Now, why is this important? Because, as the Rebbe explained previously, when you have a result that's something from something, right? When you have a regular something from something, cause and effect, like in our world, the example the Rebbe gives is a potter that's takes a piece of clay, right? Or any artisan who takes a material and makes it into a vessel, makes it into something, right? Forms it and shapes it. So when the artisan does that, he doesn't have to stick around and keep forming and shaping it and making it into a kli, making it into a vessel. The potter doesn't have to stay all day holding his hands on the pot to make it stay a pot. The pot can remain a pot and he can go walking in the shuk. The reason for this is because the reason this seems so natural to us and so normal to us is because we are used to yesh mi yesh. We are used to something that comes from something, right? In other words, I know I'm saying this all sort of a little bit out of order from how we learned it, but like this, here's the core concept. The core concept is that when the artisan makes the pot, right, when he makes this pot into this shape, all he's doing is revealing a potential that was in the clay already, right? The clay existed before the potter got here. The potential to be a pot existed before the potter got here. All the potter did is he took that potential and he actualized it, right? You could say the exact same thing about me pushing my mug, by the way. The mug has the ability to be 3 inches that way, right? I move it, and now I can go anywhere I want in the whole world. This mug will stay in the same spot, all else being equal, yeah? The reason why is because this thing existed before I got here. In other words, it has an inherent ability to exist. It didn't need me to make it exist, right? All I'm doing with my cause and effect is revealing a potential it already has, right? The mug has the ability, even when the mug is here, it has the ability to be there. All I'm doing is revealing its potential. Now it's over there. That's all. And there's no reason why it won't stay there, right? Because just as it existed when it was over here, it can now exist when it's over here. In other words, the existence is constant. It existed before I got here, and it exists after I leave. That's why it exists after I leave, because I didn't have anything to do with it existing. All I did was bring out a potential that was in the thing. Yeah? Just like when the potter makes a pot out of the piece of clay. But when you create something yesh ma'ayin, this is the core thing. When you create something from nothing, there was no potential for this thing to exist before. So when you bring about the effect is constantly dependent on the one that brings it about. Because there was no potential at all, there was nothing here before. There was no potential at all for the thing to exist in any way. So now that it has been made to exist, it requires constant involvement to make it continue exist. Before there was nothing, there was no potential for something even, and now I've brought the thing into being. So this last week when we described this, we said that's why the rock only flies upward as long as it has the energy from your hand, right? If you took high school physics, right, you know that the second you throw the rock upwards, the acceleration of gravity is trying to pull it back down, right? And as soon as it runs out of the energy that you put into it to throw it up, right, what happens is gravity brings it back down and it falls like every other rock, right? In other words, the flight of the rock, because it wasn't natural, because the flight did not exist before you picked up this rock and threw it, the potential for this flight didn't exist, right? Now, when you do this action and you make it fly, as soon as the energy you gave the rock runs out, the rock stops flying, right? The rock needs your constant involvement. It needs the energy that you put into it. The second that energy runs out, the rock falls back down to the earth, right? And it's the same thing the Rebbe is saying. This is a mashal, this is a metaphor for God creating. When God creates, the involvement must be constant. Because since this thing did not exist at all before, and now God is making it exist, something from nothing, therefore it requires God's constant involvement to make it exist. And that's basically what we said up through our last class. Yes, please.
There is a problem with that.
What's the problem?
When you describe cause and effect the way we see it,
yeah,
it's obvious.
Yeah.
Okay, we put it on the side because that's the way we see
yeah.
it. And now you go and explain create yesh me'ayin.
Yeah.
And you say, oh, but God can create something without cause and effect.
Yes.
Without what we know.
Yes.
But then when you want to explain why he needs to be involved the whole time,
yes,
you go back to our view and you said, listen, there's no such a thing that can be yesh me'ayin, and he has to be involved all the time. If he can do yesh me'ayin, he can make it stay like that without his involvement.
You're saying because once we say that God can do things that we don't understand once, we can now say it an infinite amount of times.
Exactly.
That's a very good point. That's not addressed in our mimer at all. Right? In this mimer, we are going to take it on faith that when we are saying this about God, there's good basis for this. In other words, or a different way of putting this is that, like I said, this isn't really a philosophical argument. In other words, you're 100% correct. We are not saying how God is forced to do it. We are explaining how God does do it.
Okay.
How do I know that God does it this way? Not in our mimer.
Okay.
Right? Okay. This is a famous question I explained when we learned this in Tanya, that Rabbi Khan actually says this is why when the Alter Rebbe does this in Tanya, he doesn't give the example of the throwing of the rock. He gives the example of Kriyas Yamsuf, right? Because the Alter Rebbe wants to show that this whole idea is musharsh in the Torah itself. In other words, in Revelation, that God himself told us in the Torah that this is how he does it, right? So he says the splitting of the sea, right? Which is the whole diuk there that Rabbi Yoel is making is the reason the Alter Rebbe uses an example from the Torah, because the throwing of the rock is a much better example, because the throwing of the rock is something you can actually go out and do, right? The splitting of the sea, no one who's around nowadays ever saw that, right? So what's the metaphor you're giving me from a one-time miracle in history that no one around has seen, right? So the reason the Alter Rebbe uses such a strange example, which doesn't really bring it much closer to the seichel at all, right? You know, to us it might be all the same, creating something from nothing, splitting the sea. It all seems equally impossible, right? Why does the Alter Rebbe use such a strange example there? The reason he uses that example, says Rabbi Yoel, is because he wants to show that this is not just a pure philosophical argument. This is based on facts, exactly facts meaning in Torah, right? So we're not going from our experience to God. We're going from what God told us about how he himself behaves in the Torah, right?
But I think the great thing about the creation of God,
yeah,
that you take everything that he created and make it function. So now the creation actually continues to create itself day by day, and the involvement of God is still involved. It's not that it's not involved, but the great thing about this creation, that the creation actually propelled himself in all the spheres of life. From a cockroach,
yes,
that continued to do his procreation and what it is
right.
to do to us, which actually we do all the idea that the entire world is actually it's an inertial power that continues himself.
To some extent, yes, I agree with you. It's not really the topic of our mimer. I agree with you though. There is such an idea, right? That the Hashem puts kochot into the world. We say the tzva hashamayim are kayamim beish, the tzva haaretz are kayamim b'min, right? That Hashem puts a certain eternality. There's a certain ein sofiyut. There's a certain infinitude that God is malbish within the olam hazeh. That it has a certain kiyum atzmi. It has a certain self-sustaining capacity. That's actually a different topic. Oh, I can see what the connection is.
Yeah, because with the idea that we come into this class
Yeah.
and sitting over here, all five of us,
Yeah.
that's the proof of that. Because we are not here because we were invited, something like that. We came over here because we need the thing. You know, our soul needs that thing that
We are saying even more fundamental though, Yossi. We're not talking about things that are felt or understood. We're talking about the etzem kiyum, right? The fundamental, the existence itself, that there should be something rather than nothing, right? So what we're saying is, what we said until last week, is that this, because it's yesh ma'ayin, something from nothing, right? You can understand, not this proves, Ronnie, but you can understand the sense in which everything is dependent on Hashem at every moment. Because there is no prior existence on which everything relies, right? In other words, if everything was created something from something, then there was an earlier something that already existed, and now all it's doing is it's changing. The old something is changing into a new something. There's a kayach that's coming into a pearl. There's a potential that's coming into an actual. But since the world was created not just with a process, but Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz, the world was created all at once. Bara, it just was. First it wasn't, then it was, right? What that shows you, what that indicates, what that means is that the thing that is the result is dependent constantly on the one that is bringing it into being, right? That it has no prior existence to depend on, right? The way that the pot depends on the piece of clay, or my mug over here depends on my mug over here, right?
But even the pot that depends on the clay,
Yeah.
the clay was made yesh me'ayin.
It's all mashal, right? It's a mashal. We're just talking about those two steps. That's exactly the point. The point is, where did the clay come from, right? That's the famous thing. But I want to take so we've said everything constantly depends on God. That's basically what we finished last week. Everything depends on Hashem constantly. Yes? Like the stone that's thrown in the air, its flight depends constantly on the force that made it fly, right? I want to take now a little diversion, kind of to the side. Hopefully you'll see what the point of this is. Because it's important to... It's going to be one of these things where I make everything more complicated, but hopefully in the end it was worth it. In other words, now we have, at this juncture, we have a very, what we would say, a shitchiisdik. We have a very superficial understanding of what we really mean that everything depends on God constantly, right? We understand the basic concept. The basic concept is that since this thing didn't exist in potential before, right? So now that it's actual, it depends on the one that is actualizing it constantly, right? This we understand. But we understand the words at least. But what this means regarding Hashem and what Chassidus is really trying to say, what the Rebbe Rashab is really trying to get through to us, requires a little bit more context. So I'm going to try and give the context as best as I know how. This is partially like therapy for me because this is a context that I was never given in yeshiva. This is something that I had to piece together on my own and maybe in one or two one-on-one things over the years. In other words, when I first learned Tanya, nobody gave me this. So as revenge on my teachers, I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to spoon feed it to you, right? So, what? Biyad Yotzer. I was going to say Bria Yesh Ma'ayin, right? It didn't exist in potential. I'm actualizing it. So, not really. L'chaim.
It existed. It just wasn't given. You weren't given.
I received it, just not as quickly or as easily as I would have liked. That's all. I really have no grounds to complain. Anyway, so the secret that they don't teach you when you learn this part of Tanya for the first time, and really the reason the Alter Rebbe doesn't say it, I think, personally, if you ask me, Why the Alter Rebbe doesn't talk about all this? Well, you could say several reasons. First of all, it's not really germane. It's not really the point of what he's saying in Tanya, and there's lots of things related to what it says in Tanya the Alter Rebbe could have said but didn't. First of all, there may not be any serious explanation. You may not need any more explanation than that. But second of all, if you need another reason, I have a suspicion that a lot of the Chassidim to whom the Alter Rebbe is giving the Tanya originally, to whom the Alter Rebbe was originally teaching Tanya, I have a feeling they knew this already. In other words, they knew things. If you learn the Frierdiker Rebbe's Sichos, the Sichos of the previous Lubavitch Rebbe, which are unbelievable, everyone should learn them. He has Sefer Sichos, and he also has a very famous Sefer called Likutei Diburim, which is his gathered talks. It is unbelievable. It's the heart of Chassidus. The Frierdiker Rebbe gave us his, it's hard to even explain, his personal memoirs of everything that he received, both in the study and the performance of Chassidus. Lots of stories from his childhood and of Chassidim that he knew, and all of the things he received from his father, the Rebbe Rashab. And the Frierdiker Rebbe basically gave the whole history of Chassidus, the whole history of all the Rebbes and everything that took place. And I think that a lot of this was more of like an oral tradition by the Chassidim, but we were Zeicha, we merited that the Frierdiker Rebbe said them himself, and they were written down. So now we have them. We have basically from the horse's mouth, as they say, right? If you want a first-hand account of what does it mean, Lubavitch, what was the shtetl in Lubavitch, what were the Chassidim like, right? You don't have to trust other Chassidim who got their notions from who knows where, right? You can go to the Frierdiker Rebbe's Sichos, and you can read it yourself. You can go see exactly what he says, right? Anyway, I could talk about the Frierdiker Rebbe's Sichos all day. The Frierdiker Rebbe says that in the generation of the Alter Rebbe, when the Alter Rebbe made his Chadarim, which was like his small yeshiva, right, which had, I think, if I recall correctly, 2 or 3 levels. There was like a base, for more beginners, intermediate and advanced, I think it was 3 levels. So to test into the Alter Rebbe's yeshiva and become a yeshiva student by the Alter Rebbe, right, a student in one of these yeshivas, you were tested on basically the entire Torah, right? To be a student to the Alter Rebbe, right, you had to be proficient in the Talmud, right? And all of its commentaries, etc., as it came down the generations into halacha. And you had to know Jewish philosophy. You were tested on Kuzari, and I think Rav Yosef Albo, if I remember correctly, different Sifrei Chakira of Jewish philosophy from the Rishonim, from the Middle Ages. And you were tested on Kabbalah. You had to be familiar with the works of the Ramak and the Arizal and the Zohar, right? And then you were ready to study Chassidus Chabad, right? So it shouldn't surprise us that when we learn Tanya for the first time, at whatever age and in whatever setting, right, not necessarily do we know everything that the prime students of the Alter Rebbe themselves would have known when they learned Tanya, right? So I'm not saying this is for sure the reason the Alter Rebbe doesn't say it. I'm just saying maybe it's an additional reason. It could be that in the times of the Alter Rebbe, when Shara Yichud V'Emunah was studied, a lot of the Chassidim to whom the Alter Rebbe was teaching Chassidus had already had a lot of prior knowledge and context that we as very simple Jews, right, may not have. I speak for myself, that I definitely didn't have. So, with that Hakdama, the secret is that they don't teach you when you first learn Shara Yichud V'Emunah, when you first learn Tanya. The secret is that it is not a chidush, it is not an innovation of the Baal Shem Tov or of the Alter Rebbe, that the world constantly depends on Hashem. The world constantly depending on Hashem is something that I think Kimat, almost all, if not all, Chekrei Yisrael have always said. In other words, the Jewish philosophers, including the Rambam most famously, all say that the world depends on Hashem constantly.
Where does the Rambam say?
The world depends on Hashem constantly. Right? This is not something that's original to Chassidus. In fact, if you think that that's the Iker, if you think that's the Alter Rebbe's main point here, you don't understand what the Alter Rebbe is saying. The Alter Rebbe is introducing a new Shita. This is Shitas Baal Shem Tov. The Alter Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov revealed a whole new dimension of Torah. Right? Now, the Baal Shem Tov's new thing is not really so new, right? Because in fact, if you learn Shar Yichud V'Emunah in the first chapter, where the thing that he attributes to the Baal Shem Tov is really, it says in Midrash Tehillim, right? The Baal Shem Tov taught, but really it's in the Midrash already from hundreds of years earlier, right? So when you say that it was the Chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov, it depends what you mean, right? Maybe he was the first one to bring it out, right? Or to systematize it, or to notice this Midrash. There's lots of different things you could explain, right? One of the explanations is the Baal Shem Tov was just the popularizer, right? He was the one that made sure that everybody knows this Midrash. Before, maybe it was looked over a little bit, right? So even what we say is the Chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov is not really so new, right? It already has roots in much older things, right? Nevertheless, in this matter, the Baal Shem Tov is saying something, kimat, something new. In other words, the Baal Shem Tov, even though he's based on a midrash, etc., right? He is taking it to a conclusion that, to my knowledge, that conclusion had never been taken before, right? No one had ever said, these are the ramifications, this is what this midrash means, right? So, this leads to the question, these two facts. Number one, everyone has always said that the world depends on Hashem at every moment, right? And number two, the Baal Shem Tov is teaching us a true chidush, right, in the relationship of God and the world, right? So it comes out that if we think what the Alter Rebbe here is saying is just that the world depends constantly on Hashem, right, we've probably misunderstood what's going on here. So let me explain to you the difference, right? In other words, I'm going to explain to you there's different ways or different levels at which the world constantly depends on Hashem. And this is the context I want to give you before we move forward. There's different ways the world can constantly depend on Hashem. And they're not all created equal, pun intended. They're not all created equal. The Baal Shem Tov, pardon me, the Rambam, start with the Rambam. The Rambam, when the Rambam says that the world depends constantly on Hashem, when he says this in Moreh Nevuchim, he is saying this in basically the same sense that Lahavdil Aristotle said it, right? This is not the Rambam's original idea. The Rambam himself writes, he bases most of this philosophy on the klalim that he received from Aristotle, right? He didn't receive from Aristotle directly, he received from the Islamic philosophers who had rediscovered Aristotle, etc., etc. It's a long story, but basically these principles all go back, way back, right, to Greek philosophy. And of course, if you learn some of the ancient books of Jewish history, they claim that a lot of the Greek philosophy was originally learned from the Jewish sages, the Jewish chachamim, Jewish neviim even. That's a whole other story. The general principle is like this, right? Aristotle, a guy, an Oved Avodah Zarah guy, right? A non-Jewish idolater, right? He knew that the world constantly depends on God, right? How did he know this? Right? He didn't even believe, he wasn't even a monotheist, he didn't even believe in only one God. And yet he knew that the world constantly depends on basically something like God, right? How did he know this? He said like this. In our world, there are things that change. That's how he begins, right? Not a very radical thing to say. I think most people would agree. Although the truth is that before Aristotle, there were other Greek philosophers who tried to say nothing changes, which is where you get the famous paradoxes of Zeno that everyone's heard of, right? Where motion is impossible because before you cross the distance, you have to go halfway. Before you go halfway, you have to go a quarter. Very famous, right?
The arrow paradox.
Yeah, but exactly, the arrow paradox, very good. So some of us, most of us would agree, and not be stubborn, most of us would agree that something changes, right? Let's say, for example, I want to give a very neutral example. So I'm going to use the example. Let's say an ice cream is left on the table on a deck outside in the Atlanta summer, right? The ice cream melts. That's a change. And really, you could use any change in the whole world for Aristotle's purposes. It doesn't have to be this. It could be anything. It could be a change not just solid to liquid, which is melting. It could be a change in location. It could be something growing in size. There's all different types of changes you can have. Changing in color, right? All different types of changes. Any change would do. I want to use the ice cream sitting on the deck table that's melting in the Atlanta summer, right? The ice cream is changing. Right? At any given moment. In other words, we're going to take one infinitesimally small slice of time, right? 1 second, less than a second, right? You're taking a moment in time. At this moment, this thing is changing, right? The ice cream is melting in this moment. A change is taking place, right? So he said something very simple, right? Really fundamentally very simple. He said, if something is changing, changing means a potential is being actualized. Sound familiar, right? Says there's a potential. In this case, the ice cream is solid. It has a potential to be liquid, right? And the potential is becoming actual. It has the ability to be liquid, and that potential is being brought out, right? Any time a potential is being brought out, yeah, something has to be doing the bringing out. And there's a very simple reason why this must be so. Because if you didn't need something to bring about this change would have been brought out already, right? Why is this happening now, right? Why didn't the ice cream melt when it was sitting in the freezer, for example, right? Why is this change happening now? And the answer is, in this case, what's causing this change? What's causing this change is the temperature, right? There's a change in temperature. The temperature, or how you would say it in the way of modern science, right, is you would say the molecules are moving faster, right? That's what it means, that it's hotter, right? You would say the molecules are moving faster, which it breaks their bonds that they had, which is what makes it melt, right? I think. So the molecules are moving faster. Now, Aristotle was very stubborn. So Aristotle said, okay, so the molecules are moving faster, but the molecules are moving, which means they're changing. If something is changing, that must mean there's a potential being actualized. First the molecules were here. Now they're getting faster. They're moving to over here, right? So something must be making that change, because if there wasn't something making that change, right, the change would have happened already, right? So what's making the molecules move faster? You would say, oh, well, it's the radiation from the sun, right? So then you would look at the radiation and you'd say, okay, so there's this radiation coming from the sun. But what is making this radiation arrive from the sun? Because that itself is a change. This radiation wasn't always here, it's coming from the sun right now. So then you'd say, oh, well, if you took high school physics again, which is as high as I got, by the way, so and I don't think I'm putting it down. You would say there's the forces, the different fields interact, right, and they produce the radiation. You say, okay, well, the fields are interacting, and they're interacting all the way down, right? So in other words, this bit of radiation, these quanta were coming from the sun, they come in a stream. So there was, this one is pushing this one, which is pushing this one, which is pushing this one, which is pushing this one, right? And you could follow the chain all the way back to the sun. And again, this isn't a chain in time, right? We're looking at 1 second of time. Right? We're not looking, I'm not saying in the past, I'm saying right now, this thing is moving, which means something else must be making it move, which means something else must be making it move, right? So eventually you get back to the sun in our metaphor, and you say, well, what's making these fields come from the sun? You'd say, well, there's nuclear reactions. So you say, oh, there's nuclear reactions. So then there's different interactions inside the sun that are taking place. And you'd say, what makes those reactions take place? And then eventually you get to, you would say, the forces of nature, right? There's a nuclear force and electromagnetism, right? 2 nuclear forces in gravity and electromagnetism. And you would say, well, what's making them do their actions? And you would go all the way down, and eventually, this was Aristotle's thought. Aristotle's thought is that what's clear is that since each thing that moves requires something else to make it move, or change, move is actually the wrong word. Since each thing is that changes requires something else to make it change, right? You can follow this back as long as you like, but it can't go on forever, right? Because if following this back went on forever, the whole thing never would have started, right? If you go infinitely back, that means there was never any beginning. So what started all of this? It would mean that nothing started all of it, which is absurd, right? Nothing, that would mean this whole thing never got started, right? So Aristotle comes to the very logical conclusion that there must be something that makes other things move, but it itself never moves, right? Change. There must be something else that makes other things change, but it itself doesn't have to change. He called this the unmoved mover, or the unchanging changer in our language, right? And in the later scholars, the scholars of the religions of Avraham Avinu, right, like the Rambam says that this is no one other than Hashem. Hashem is the one who is the. There must be a beginning, something that makes other things move but themselves doesn't move, right? Something that makes other things change but themselves don't change. This must be Hashem. Why am I telling you all this? Because you'll notice that in this whole explanation, everything always depends on Hashem. In this whole explanation, right? In other words, for an ice cream to melt for a split second, right, depends on Hashem absolutely. Because Hashem is the beginning of the chain, right? If Hashem isn't there to make the first things move, the first things that move, right? None of this would be happening right now. Not in time, right? It's not like people think that Hashem had to create the universe at the beginning and then it just falls like dominoes. That's actually not what the Rambam says. The Rambam says right now everything depends on Hashem, right? Because for anything to change, and by the way, there's very similar arguments for things that are standing still as well. So it doesn't just have to be things that are moving, right? Although everything always is moving, so that's not really much of a concern. But the things, anything that's changing in that moment depends absolutely on Hashem. Because if it's not for Hashem at the beginning of that chain, of that beginning of that explanation, the whole thing has no explanatory power, right? You can't, in a very real sense, the Rambam would say, you can't explain why the ice cream melts without the existence of God. And the same with every other fact in the world. Nothing is explicable. Nothing can actually happen, right, without Hashem. Everything is constantly dependent on Hashem. The ice cream melting in this second is absolutely, inherently dependent on Hashem. At every second. Everything depends on God at every second. Yeah? God is not just the original creator of the universe. He's the sustainer. He conserves is a different word. He sustains or conserves the universe in being. If God wasn't still around to be the foundation of all existence and all being, everything would cease to be. Nothing would have its support, right? Everything is totally dependent on God, in the opinion of the Rambam. So like I said, we're not saying, when we say that everything is dependent on Hashem, that by itself is not a chiddush, right? You don't need this whole thing about yesh ma'ayin, right? The Rambam says, interestingly, that this is true whether or not you believe in yesh ma'ayin. You could even believe that everything is yesh mi yesh, right? And that the universe in some sense has always existed, and this would still be true, right? Because even if in some way the universe always existed, it doesn't matter. This ice cream can't melt now without God, right? So even if in some sense matter always existed, which is what Aristotle believed, which is a total heresy to Judaism, God forbid that a Jew should believe such a thing, that in some sense the universe always existed, right? We absolutely believe that the universe was created. It says so in the Torah quite directly. Nevertheless, the Rambam says, even if, God forbid, you don't believe that the universe was created, that has nothing to do with the universe depending on God at every moment. The universe depends on God every moment, whether He created it, or whether He just organized it, or whatever else you want to say. There has to be this unchanging being who changes other things, otherwise none of this works. Depends at every moment, right? And the truth is that there's many other ways in which everything depends on God at every moment that I'm not getting into. This is just one facet, but they all share this trait, that number one, we're not talking about time. We're not talking about a chain of events, one thing causing another in time. We're talking about a chain of causes right now. Everything is dependent on God at every moment, right? And if so, that means we have to dig in deeper into what it says in Tanya, right? We have to look deeper at what we're saying here. Because we're saying here something totally different. Our whole argument is about, our whole explanation is about yesh ma'ayin, something from nothing. Why do we need this something from nothing business? Where is that coming from? Everything is dependent on God at every moment without all this complication about God causes it in a totally different way than we cause things and we experience things. There's something yesh ma'ayin versus yesh miyesh. If the universe was purely yesh miyesh, it would depend on God every second. It's not the point, right? So that brings us to what are we saying here, right? What is the Tanya saying? What is the Rebbe Rashab saying?
Supposed to be back ein if he stops.
That's part of it, yeah.
Which is, what is
He said if God stops, everything becomes ayin again, which is part of it.
יש מאין, הוא מפסיק לדבר, אז זה נהיה עוד פעם. הוא כל הזמן חוזר למקור שלו.
The real ikr, the real point that the Alter Rebbe is getting at is not that everything simply depends on Hashem at every moment. Because again, you don't need this whole thing with yesh ma'ayin, etc. Something from nothing to explain how everything depends on Hashem at every moment.
Because in the way that I see it, everything's Hashem. For me, everything, the existence actually, everything is Hashem. Whatever you touch, whatever it is Hashem.
We're trying to say, very good, I think it's related, we are trying to say not just that everything depends on Hashem, we are trying to say that the nature of, that everything is nothing other than an expression of Hashem. Exactly as Yossi says. Yeah. We are not trying to say that everything simply depends on Hashem. If it was everything depends on Hashem, for this you don't need Chassidus. It's not what we're talking about, right? What we are talking about is that not just that everything depends on Hashem. Everything depends on Hashem in a very specific way is really what we're saying. It doesn't just depend on Hashem for its motion, right? Or for its being conserved in existence, etc., etc. We are saying everything depends on Hashem in a way that it is created yesh ma'ayin, which, as we're going to see, what something from nothing means is not just that a thing depends on Hashem, but really that a thing is nothing other than an expression of Hashem. And this is really the point that Chassidus is making. The chidush of the Baal Shem Tov is not that the world depends on God, it's that the world is nothing other than Getlichkeit. The world is nothing other than godliness. For this, you need this whole explanation of yesh ma'ayin. Because if you think about it, think back to now we're going to go a step further, right? So now we have two metaphors. We have a lot more actually than two, but I don't want to confuse you. We have the melting ice cream. The melting ice cream is our metaphor for, or our example of what the Rambam would mean, for example, that the world depends on Hashem at every moment, right? Contrast that with our metaphor of the rock that's thrown in the air, right? Which is the Rebbe Rashab's metaphor, right? The Rebbe Rashab's metaphor for what he's getting at, his mashal, right? What aspect of the melting ice cream is godly?
Everything.
No. I don't mean objectively. I mean in the metaphor. In the example we gave of the melting ice cream, we say it depends on God constantly, right? Which is true. But how godly does that make the melting of the ice cream?
Because the point is...
No, but answer my question before the point.
Yeah,
rephrase the question.
Yeah, 1 second. I'll rephrase the question first.
The answer for that is
Yeah.
the perspective, who is taking the ice cream, putting it over there and see this happening.
No, not exactly. No. I'm asking you, in the metaphor that we gave, in the story that we gave, this ice cream can't melt without God's help, right? Because the ice cream is made to melt by the molecules. The molecules are made to melt by the radiation. The radiation is made...
So maybe the word is change.
What?
The word that you're looking for is change.
Change. But no, the ice cream, yeah, I'm talking about change. What aspect of the thing is godly? You're saying change is your answer, right? The answer is no aspect of the thing has to be godly, right? It depends on God, right? That doesn't mean it's godly. It just means that if God wasn't here, this thing wouldn't be happening. Technically, right? But this thing is just an ice cream in this story that I gave you, right? It's just an ice cream. There's nothing getlich about the ice cream. Nothing godly about it. It could be anything, and it is everything. Everything that ice cream is very godly. I agree, don't worry. But the question is what but even the enjoyment of the ice cream, right, which is also a change, right? Even that, there's nothing godly, right? It's wonderful, it's sensational, it's incredible, it's enjoyable, it's delicious, but it's an ice cream. There's nothing fundamentally connecting ice cream to God, to godliness, right? In other words, what the ice cream is doesn't have to do anything to do at all with what God is, right? The only connection between these two things is that if God was not there to be the basis for this chain of causes and effects, this effect would not be able to take place, right?
The ice cream will not exist.
Right. So the what? The ice cream. Well, yes, correct. Exactly. The motion, or in our precise case, the melting of the ice cream, really. But you're right. Even the bringing into being of the ice cream, which is all change, right? It wouldn't be able to come about, right? But now that it has come about, right? What about this reflects God? And the answer is nothing really, right? The fact that it exists, right? The fact that this came about depends in a profound way on God. God needs to be in the chain of causes. He needs to be there as the first cause that brought about this whole chain, right? But now that we're down here by the ice cream, first of all, the ice cream is the end of the chain. There are things that are much closer to God at the beginning of the chain, first of all. So the ice cream is already very distant from Hashem in this chain of causes and effects. And second of all, the only thing that's godly about this is that if there was no God, this couldn't have come about. But that's really, to show you how little godliness that is, you have to compare the ice cream with everything else in the universe that changes, right? The melting of this ice cream is no different than, someone getting shot, a book, right? Dust swirling on Jupiter, right? It's all of these things. In order for the change to take place, it depends on God to exist. Nothing about what's happening is godly. There is no penimius, there is no inner significance or inner expression of godliness in this thing. This is just the end of a long chain of events that require God to be its beginning. Yes? The throwing of the rock, when you take the rock and you throw it in the air, right? And this is a metaphor for God creating something from nothing, right? You take the rock and you throw it in the air. The flight of the rock is dependent on the energy that your arm put into the rock when you threw it. Yeah? To what extent is the flight of the rock related to the energy in your arm? What? Proportionately, I would say differently. I would say 100%. There is no. No. There is nothing about the flight of this rock that is unrelated from the energy that was in your arm, right? In fact, in reality, the rock is not even really flying, because rocks can't fly. Right? The whole flight of the rock, when you pick up the rock and you throw it, is a manifestation of the energy that's in your arm. The rock can't fly. Rocks can't fly. So the fact that the rock is flying is not even really the rock. It's just the energy from your arm expressed in a different place. Right? It's even though on the surface, when you say everything is depending on God, these two things sound like they're the same. Right? Really, they're actually opposites one from the other. These are not the same. These are opposite concepts, right? The whole idea of everything depending on God, that's in the Rambam, or that comes from the Greeks, lahavdil, all of these different things, that idea of depending on God places God at a distance from the thing that depends on him. Right? God is the beginning, there's a long chain, this is the end of the chain, and where the chain goes has no inner connection at all to what starts the chain, really. Right? It's just things that came out, it's just things that depend on it, right? It's like saying if I put 3 books on this table and an egg on top of it, so the egg has to have a special relationship with the floor, because the floor is holding up the table, and the table's holding up the books, and the book's holding up the egg. Don't tell me ridiculous, right? Even though, what do you mean? It depends on the floor every second. If it wasn't for the floor, this egg wouldn't be here, it would be broken, right? If it wasn't for the floor holding it up at every second, who cares, right? It's the original, okay, so you need the floor. That's it, though. You need the floor for this egg to sit here. That's it. You need the floor to explain how it's possible. That's it. That's all you need it for, right? When we're saying God, when we're saying in Tanya, in the Rebbe Rashab, that everything depends on God at every second, right? Because he creates it yesh ma'ayin, something from nothing. We're saying the exact opposite. We're saying in fact, not only does it depend on him at every second, it isn't even real. It's almost the opposite, right? Not that this thing is real and it depends on God at every second. We're saying there is no thing. There's only the depending on God. The depending on God is all that's here, right? It's not like here's this thing and there's this long chain and that's the explanation of how it can be here. It comes from the exact opposite direction, right? We're not trying to... What?
It's opposite, but it's not opposite, because all there is dependence on God. That's all there is.
Yes, but we mean something so different by that, though. You see, we mean a totally different thing. Because the egg is not all... the melting of the ice cream, not all there is dependence on God, right? Dependence on God was one step in this chain of things that take place, and the chain can go anywhere. Right? Like I said, if you have an object sitting on this table, there's no special connection with it on the floor. Everything on this table depends on the floor. But what does the floor have to do with anything on the table? Nothing, because it's just a chain of causes and effects. Right? And the chain of causes and effects, just as every step in the chain, you just get further and further away from the first thing. Right? We're saying something radically, totally different. Right? Which is that, first of all, there is no chain, really. Right? The chain is broken. Because the chain of causes and effects is not how God creates the universe. God creates the universe something from nothing, right? Yesh ma'ayin, which is the opposite of a chain, right? The opposite of there being a series or a process of events. There is no process, right? God is acting directly to bring everything into being. And what does that mean? It means that this thing that results, right, not is a separate thing that in some way ultimately depends on Hashem, right? This thing is nothing other than dependence on Hashem. That's all that's here. Just like the flight of the rock is nothing other than the power in your arm that's making it fly, right? Because rocks can't fly. So what's the parallel to rocks can't fly? Is things can't exist, right? You start with nothing. From nothing, nothing comes. Things can't exist. Right? Nothing exists, and it's impossible that something can exist. There's no potential that anything can exist, right? It does exist, right? There are things that exist, right? So that's like saying, the rock actually flies, right? You say, rocks can't fly, but this rock is flying. You say, Chacham, it's not because rocks can fly. It's because someone took it and threw it. Right? It's not that rocks can fly. So similarly, things can't exist. God has made things exist, right? Say, Chacham, it's not because things can exist. It's because God is making them exist. It's not about depending on Hashem constantly, right? It's about the very nature of the thing that results. This is a totally different explanation from what the Rambam says. The Rambam says the thing that results is just a result at the end of a long chain. It has nothing to do with what started the chain except for the fact that it happens to depend on it. Right? Here we're saying something totally different. There's no chain. There's no chain of being between the thing and Hashem. Hashem brings the thing into being something from nothing, which means he has to constantly be involved. And what do we mean by he has to constantly be involved? We mean there is no thing here except for his involvement, right? This thing has no being except for Hashem's involvement in creating it.
Didn't you say that once I read that it uses both?
Yes, that's also... we explained this 2 classes ago. We talked about it more. It's complicated, but sof kol sof, it's complicated. It is both, but ultimately there is no aspect of this thing which comes about without a yesh ma'ayin. Everything that results at one step or another, there was this leap where there had to be a yesh ma'ayin. Now, we make it complicated because we also want to say that not only is this thing nothing other than dependence on Hashem, but its teichen pnimi is godly as well, which means that it also is created through a process, right? I'm summarizing very fast. So in other words, just one second, let me finish this thought. So in other words, what we mean is that we don't just want the very existence, the metzius of this thing to be godly, which is what we're saying now, right? We're saying its very being is nothing other than godliness, right? We also want to say that its mahos is also godly. And that's why there's a process as well, right? But the process is itself punctuated by different yesh ma'ayins, different somethings from nothings, right? So in other words, even though we say there is a seder hishtalshelus, right, our seder hishtalshelus is full of holes. Our order of causes and effects is very holy. It's full of holes, right? Like from Atzilus to Bria is a yesh ma'ayin, is a great leap, right? You can't explain, you can't get cause and effect Atzilus from Bria, right? And so on and so forth. There's other yesh ma'ayins. There's one shita which says Atzilus itself is yesh ma'ayin from Or Sof, etc., etc. There's all these different gaps, even though there's also a process, right? And figuring out the significance of all of this together, right, is beyond our pay grade. That's just to answer your question.
That's beyond. But
yeah.
The point is, if the creations, if God created everything around us that we discussed now, from nothing, and now we agree that He created for nothing, and therefore that the creation of what we have over here is the creation of God. Right. So there's God in everything, every little square.
That's exactly right.
So it's very simple. Since that God created all this carpet over here with the dots from nothing, and now we have billions of dots over here.
Yeah.
So everything with dot is creation of God. There's God.
Correct. From nothing. Correct.
So there's no complicated thing. The only thing that's complicated is how you see it. Yeah. And how you connect it to the godliness of things to be able to see all those dots.
That's right.
It's like you take a blind guy, take a blind man, tell him about God and the creation of God and stuff like that. And he's blind. How can he see it if he never saw it? Right. So, but not be connected to God, not to understand the connection to God, and be part of the creation.
So the tricky part, in other words, So in other words, the tricky part is the avodah, which we're going to get to. Is how do you live like this, right? That's the question is how do you live like this? To say it is one thing, but first we understand, right? In other words, first the Rebbe is explaining to us how you think about this, right? Which itself is an avodah. In other words, a person should take time, right, to think about all of this, to think about the different gedarim, yesh ma'ayin, something from nothing, and what does it mean, something from nothing, right? And then you could think about the mashal of the throwing of the rock, which is very helpful, right? And even thinking about these things and setting aside the time to think about them is to an extent an avodah, right? And to learn about it, of course, etc. That itself is an avodah. And then, as we're going to see later in the Maimer, the Rebbe is going to describe what it means if a person lives like this. A person lives his life according to the truth described in this Maimer. So we're actually going to get to that. I see that we're way over time, so I wish everyone a good evening and a good Shabbos, and God willing, we'll continue next week.